From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Scott. We have a very full program this afternoon, so of necessity, our introductions of the speakers will be somewhat shorter than this morning, but that is in no means a reflection on the excellence of our speakers this afternoon. In fact, in looking over his impressive and I might even say solemn resume in preparation for introducing our next speaker, the feeling came over me that I perhaps should begin with prayer. Instead, let me begin with another time-tested religious practice by taking up an offering. Not really, but figuratively. As treasurer of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, let me appeal to you good people to dig deeply into your pockets and make a generous tax-deductible contribution to permit us to continue to bring you the Word of God. The Word of Lincoln, sorry. For our viewing audience out there in cyberspace, you can go to our website, lincoln-org, lincoln-org, to learn. Oh, yes, I'm sorry, lincoln-institute.org. Let me repeat that. lincoln-institute.org to learn where our mailing address is to send us a donation. You'll feel better for it, and we will bless you for it. But now back to my sermon, I mean introduction. Ronald C. White, Jr. currently is professor of church history at San Francisco Theological Seminary, where he was dean and vice president for academic affairs from 1996 through 2001. He has also taught at Princeton Theological Seminary, Fuller Theological Seminary, and the School of Theology at Claremont. To my somewhat irreverent mind, that's an awful lot of theology. I must tell you, though, that in meeting Mr. White for the first time this morning, he assured me that he is a historian, not a theologian. Evidently, that's been a lot of theology for Dean White also. He doesn't seem to be able to hold a job for very long. His resume lists, by my count, 19 different positions in a 38-year career. But to be fair, several of the positions were at the same institution, and some were held concurrently, including one interesting combination in the early 1970s when he was a professor of American Studies and chaplain at Rider College. I hope for his students' sake he was able to keep separate office hours, and for his sake also, I'm sure. But to close on a more serious note, Dean White has written widely and thoughtfully on the religious dimension of American history, social and racial reform, and the social gospel. His most recent book, Lincoln's Greatest Speech, the Second Inaugural, was published earlier this year by Simon & Schuster. The Second Inaugural, he writes, was Lincoln's last will and testament to the nation. And concurring with that benediction, I yield the podium to our next speaker.
As we begin, I want to be certain that everyone has the text of the Second Inaugural in their hands. If you don't, maybe you could put up your hands and we'll be sure to get a text to you. Some hands are going up, so if we can get that text to people, I'd like to have it in your hands. I'm deeply honored at the invitation to be speaking with you this afternoon. And I want to pay a special tribute to John Sellers, the president of this organization, as I refer to John in my acknowledgments, the point man at the Library of Congress. John, by his simple presence, opened up to me by telephone, by cajoling a person that many people had not known before in terms of Lincoln scholarship, and I'm deeply grateful to John for all that he has done. In that same spirit, every day as I worked on the Second Inaugural, I found myself conscious that I was standing on the shoulders of Lincoln scholars, past and present. I felt humbled, as one does in the western United States when one is following the trail of eminent pioneers. And so if I at times deviate from those trails, perhaps try to cut a fresh trail, it is always with appreciation of those who have done such solid work in this field. Abraham Lincoln considered the second inaugural to be his greatest speech. 11 days after offering it, he replied to a congratulatory letter, "I expect the latter to wear as well, perhaps better, than anything I have produced." But then he went on to add, "But I believe it is not immediately popular." Hold that thought. I'm going to come back in about 25 or 30 minutes and ask you your opinion as to why, if Lincoln thought this was his greatest speech, he perceived that it was not immediately popular. In speaking about Lincoln in recent weeks, mostly in the West, I've been asking the question, how many of you have seen and read the second inaugural at the Lincoln Memorial? I'm sure if I asked that question in this audience that every hand would go up. And I've asked people for their experience, their emotion in being there at the Lincoln Memorial. You recall, even though it's close to us, that we rise on those steps. We see that majestic statue of Lincoln. If you turn to the left, you see the Gettysburg Address carved in Indiana limestone on the south wall. If you turn to the right, you see the second inaugural 3 panels carved on the north wall. Would some of you be willing to say, what are your experiences a few weeks ago or a few years ago as you have visited the Lincoln Memorial? Tell me what your experiences are. I can repeat it for others. Yes?
We went to the Lincoln Memorial the week after September 11th, and reading the last paragraph that Nels was, I think Lincoln was saying, we have to be careful who we vent our anger towards.
She suggests that going to see the Lincoln Memorial and the second inaugural after September 11, a week after, that it causes us to pause as we think about how are we going to respond to those who are perhaps viewed as our enemies. Other responses? It's hard to see sometimes with the bright lights, but I'd like to get some more responses. Yes, sir. They were reading the same Bible at the time the second inaugural was delivered. As I've asked that question, I've had people respond with words such as awe, wonder, amazement. Yesterday afternoon, my wife and I wandered over again to the Lincoln Memorial and walked up those steps and stood there in preparation for today just to get a sense. I observed when I was there the sort of facial expressions of people. I noted that, I'd never done this before, I noted that most of the people were there observing the Gettysburg Address. Far fewer people were reading the second inaugural. Part of what I'm suggesting is that the second inaugural has lived under the shadow of the Gettysburg Address. We all know something about that address, of the epic battle that took place July 1, 2, 3, 1863, of the hasty preparations to have a dedication ceremony in November. I'm sure most of us know that Edward Everett was the invited speaker and that he went on for more than 2 hours, that Lincoln spoke for only 2.5 minutes. Gary Wills has attempted to set us straight on did he write it on the flap of an envelope, when did he write it, but all of that kind of contributes, doesn't it, to our amazement and engagement with the Gettysburg Address. I want to suggest here this afternoon that the second inaugural has an equally dramatic context that somehow has been lost to us. We don't visit the second inaugural in the way that today millions of visitors visit the Gettysburg Address. Well, we do visit the Lincoln Memorial, but it doesn't quite have the same sense about it. Think for a moment. A nation has just conducted an election while it is involved in a civil war. Almost unprecedented. The nation is aware, we have forgotten, that this is the first re-election of a president in 32 years in a nation that is only 76 years old. I'm not sure if I asked the extra credit question that you could answer who were the presidents in the 1840s and 1850s. Walt Whitman wrote a draft of an address filled with epithets about those who had been presidents before Lincoln. And he looked forward farther into the future for an 18th president who would one day set the nation's wrongs aright. The nation was filled, if you read the newspapers as I did, every single day, the front page is filled with the exploits and the victories of Grant and Sherman and the Northern commanders. We have forgotten that Lincoln's first words at this second appearing, what an amazing sentence. It is not 7 years ago. It's not the way he begins his other addresses, but he didn't expect to appear. In August of 1864, the Republican National Committee convened in the Astor Hotel in New York City. They communicated their results to Lincoln at the White House. They told him that today he would lose Illinois by 50,000 votes. There was no possibility of winning Pennsylvania. He would be soundly defeated in New York State. And then Lincoln took this information, and on August 23rd, he went to his cabinet. He had written out a memo. He didn't let them see the memo, but they signed the back of the envelope in which the memo was contained, and it said in these words, "When we are defeated for re-election, it will be our duty to cooperate with a new president that the nation might succeed." Take this address in your hands. The words that are most familiar to all of us are the last paragraph. If you turn to the second page, I found myself about 3 weeks ago appearing in a coffee house in Berkeley, California. I didn't have my rings in my pocket. The speaker in the first hour was speaking on advanced sex tips for girls. It was a wonderful event filled with irreverent music and all sorts of things, and I thought, how in the world are we going to transition to Lincoln? And as I sat there with a live studio audience, and this is broadcast on FM around the United States, my host stunned me by saying, "Dr. White, would you be willing to read the entire second inaugural address?" Well, I'm making the point that Lincoln wrote for the ear. Most people today write for the eye, and we need to hear these words. I suggest at the beginning of my book that we need to say these words out loud. I was in Springfield several weeks ago to sign my book in the restored old Capitol building, and the next day I went for the first time, I must admit, to the Lincoln Herndon law offices. I knew this from reading about it, but now I heard it from the guide, that as Lincoln would come into the law office in the morning, he drove his partner, Willie Herndon, just to oblivion by sitting down, spreading out on the couch, and reading aloud. We teach our children to read to themselves. Lincoln had a sense for the sound of words. Listen to the last paragraph. "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Now, I've just broken the rule that I'm trying to put forward in my book. My complaint is that that particular paragraph has been excerpted and put in American history textbooks and in books of documents, totally ripped away from the 3 paragraphs that went before. In fact, some scholars have gone so far as to suggest that it has little meshing with what went before. Not so. It grows out directly of what Lincoln had said in the first 3 paragraphs. But before we're ready to hear these words, would you come with me to Washington in the first week of March in 1865? We need to be there with the crowd to prepare ourselves to hear these words. President Abraham Lincoln had every reason to be hopeful as March 4, 1865 approached. The Confederacy was splintered, if not shattered. General William Tecumseh Sherman led 60,000 troops out of Savannah. Slashing through South Carolina, they wreaked havoc in the state that had been the seedbed of secession. At the same time, General Ulysses S. Grant was besieging Petersburg, 20 miles south of Richmond. Despite Robert E. Lee's previous record for forestalling defeat, it was clear that the badly outnumbered Confederates could not hold out much longer. Everything pointed toward victory. Apprehension intruded upon this hopeful spirit. Rumors were flying about the capital that desperate Confederates, now realizing that defeat was imminent, would attempt to abduct or assassinate the president. Remember, no president had ever been assassinated. 2 had died in office. Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton took extraordinary precautions. All roads leading to Washington had been heavily picketed for some days. The problem was greatly complicated by the presence of Confederate deserters. 1,239 Confederate deserters arrived in Washington in the month of February. Stanton posted sharpshooters on the buildings that would ring the inaugural ceremonies. Plainclothes detectives roved the city, keeping track of questionable persons. After 4 years as president, Lincoln could look ahead to 4 years as a peace president. One of the things that I want to do in our frame of reference is to change the reference. We see this as the end of Lincoln's life. Lincoln saw this as the beginning of 4 years and probably 8 years as president. With no Congress in session until December to hamper him, he would have some free rein to do some peacemaking on his own. Gamblers were even betting that the 16th president would be inaugurated for a 3rd term in 1869. The president, who had been battered by critics in Congress and the press for much of the war, was finally beginning to receive credit for his leadership. Many were suggesting, however, that the stakes were about to get higher. How would Lincoln, the successful commander-in-chief in war, be able to guide a reunited nation during what was beginning to be called Reconstruction? As the day for the inauguration drew near, everyone wondered what the president would say. No one seemed to know anything about the content of Lincoln's second inaugural speech. It was recalled that he had taken 35 minutes to deliver his first inaugural. How would Lincoln deal with the questions that were multiplying? Would he use his rhetorical skills to take the hide off his opponents in the South and the North? Was the Confederate States of America to be treated as a conquered nation? How did you demarcate between the innocent and the guilty, between citizens and soldiers? What would Lincoln say about the slaves? They had been emancipated, but what about the question of suffrage? Just beneath this outward merrymaking lay a different emotion. I felt that one of my tasks, it's the second task in Aristotle's treatise on rhetoric, was to attempt to discern the mood of the audience, and I argue that one of Lincoln's greatest skills was that he spoke to a real audience, not an ideal audience, and today political speakers speak to ideal audiences and not real audiences. And Lincoln tried to understand the mood, the temperament of the audience standing in front of him that day, even though he knew his words would be printed in all of the newspapers. A weariness of spirit pervaded the nation. The agony of battle took its toll on families everywhere. Many citizens, I argue, were filled as much with anger as with hope. Even the anticipation of victory could not compensate for the loss of so many young men cut down in death or disabled by horrible wounds, just as they were preparing to harvest the fruits of their young lives. And death and despair reached into nearly every home. The enormity and loss in the Civil War reaches across time. An estimated 623,000 men died in the Civil War. Comparisons with other wars bring it home. In World War I, the number killed was 117,000. In World War II, 405 or 407,000. In the Korean War, the death toll was 54,000. In the war in Vietnam, the number of Americans killed was 58,000. Deaths in the Civil War equaled the deaths in all other wars put together. But if World War II had produced the same proportion of deaths as did the Civil War, remembering the United States was a small nation in the 1860s, that would have meant that this generation that we're now justly honoring would have suffered 2.5 million casualties in World War II. The loss of so many fathers, husbands, brothers, sons usurped the joy and reward of imminent victory. Washington had never seen so many travelers as converged for Lincoln's second inaugural. Trains roared and smoked over the double tracks of the Baltimore and Ohio. Hotels were overflowing. Yesterday we visited the Willard, the grand 5-story hotel. It had its cots in all of its parlors. The Metropolitan and the National were filled. The hotels are literally shelving their guests, reported the correspondents for the New York Times. Lincoln and Johnson clubs housed more than 1,000 visitors. Firehouses offered more sleeping spaces. All knew that they were coming to witness a dramatic event. On Friday morning, March 3rd, visitors crowded the streets of the Capitol in spite of the inclement weather. Nothing could hide the disorder and the dirt that was everywhere. The national Capitol, barely 6 decades old, remained an almost city. Charles Dickens, in his first visit to Washington in 1842, had called the American Capitol, quote, the city of magnificent intentions. He described Washington satirically as, quote, spacious avenues that begin in nothing and lead nowhere. Streets mile long that only want homes, roads, and inhabitants. Public buildings that need but a public to be complete. One visitor from Philadelphia was plainly irked. If you want to be disgusted with a place chosen for the capital of your country, visit it in the springtime near the close of 4 days' rain, when the frost is beginning to come out of the ground. What other objects of interest may attract your notice? The muddy streets and pavements will scarcely escape you. Washington, which had been transformed into an armed camp at the beginning of the war, had now become a gigantic hospital. White buildings and tents dotted the city. Many of the 40 or so hospitals were simply makeshift wooden sheds. All were crowded. Often hundreds, sometimes thousands of soldiers lay in adjoining beds. The staggering number of wounded could not be confined to hospitals. The sick and wounded could be found in hotels, warehouses, schools, fraternal lodges. Churches vied with each other as makeshift hospitals. The thing that startled me as I tried to understand the scene to which Lincoln addressed was this reality. Their wounds marked the soldiers who came in large numbers to Lincoln's second inauguration. Amputation had become the trademark of Civil War surgery. According to federal records, 3 out of 4 operations were amputations. Too often, the surgery had to be repeated again. Many visitors professed shock at the sight of so many young men with amputated legs and arms. March 4 dawned with incessant rain. Streets oozing with soft mud, described by locals as black plaster, greeted visitors. The Corps of Engineers surveyed the scene to determine the practicality of laying pontoons on Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol to the White House. They found the bottom too unstable to hold the anchors of the needed boats. During the early morning hours, winds whipped through the city, uprooting trees. In the early morning, fog continued to hang over the city as the crowd began arriving at the east entrance of the Capitol. Carriages were in great demand. Premium prices were being offered for a ride to the Capitol. Police estimates placed the crowd between 30 and 40,000. The Philadelphia Inquirer reported that the arriving throng was present, quote, in force sufficient to have struck terror into the heart of Lee's army, had the umbrellas been muskets. What I enjoyed doing in my research was trying to find the countless diaries, often by unknown soldiers, as they described this scene. Selden Connor, a Union soldier from Michigan who had arrived in Washington only the day before, was overwhelmed at the sight of the gathering. He wrote to his mother, "There was a crowd almost numberless." Maggie Lindsley, 24, had been a supporter of the Union cause in Nashville, a view not shared by most of her friends. Encountering the crowds heading for the inaugural, she wrote later that day in her diary, "We were on the edge of a great, surging ocean of humanity." As visitors and residents walked toward the Capitol, they encountered police on horseback at every major intersection. Posters, ribbons, medals, tokens prepared for the 1864 campaign were visible everywhere. One poster from the election surely summed up the fervent sentiments of many arriving for the day's events. all who are opposed to a disgraceful armistice with traitors. Surely Lincoln would articulate these comments in his address. One medal was inscribed, "A foe to traitors," while another read, "No compromise with rebels." An 1864 ribbon captured the now clearly understood twin goals of the war, union and liberty. Well, what I'm trying to do is to bring us to these dramatic events and to prepare us for what Lincoln faced that day. Making a quick transition, when Lincoln was introduced, the crowd exploded in expectation. Noah Brooks, correspondent for the Sacramento Daily Union, described the immense crowd like a sea of heads. As far as the eye could see, the throng looked like waves breaking at their outer edges. Lincoln stepped from underneath the shelter of the Capitol building, out past the magnificent Corinthian column. At 56, he looked older than his years. As Lincoln rose, he put on and adjusted his steel-rimmed eyeglasses. He held in his left hand the inaugural address printed in 2 columns, Lincoln prepared to speak. Now I'd like you to take that text again into your hands, and if I may, I want to suggest some of Lincoln's rhetorical artistry. His rhetoric, his politics, his religion, all fused together to make this address so memorable. As I suggested earlier, Lincoln begins in a way that is not to catch our attention. In the highly charged atmosphere of wartime Washington with soldiers everywhere, it is as if he perhaps wants to lower expectations. So in line 2, if you look with me, there is less occasion for an extended address. In line 8, little that is new could be presented. In line 11, the second line from the bottom of the paragraph, no prediction in regard to it is ventured. He starts more like an observer than the main actor. The language of the first paragraph is impersonal. Yes, he uses the pronouns I and myself, but the ethos of the first paragraph, I suggest, is unemotional. Lincoln directed the force of his remarks away from himself by speaking in a passive voice. Avoiding the active voice sets up a paradigm that Lincoln follows throughout his address. After this first paragraph, he will use no more personal pronouns. Lincoln dispenses one by one with the usual contents of such an address. In the first sentence, he says this is not the occasion for an extended address. In the second sentence, he reiterates why a detailed statement was proper before, but not today. He reiterates a detailed statement was proper 4 years ago, but not today. In the third sentence, he reminds the audience that many other occasions they had had public declarations on every point and phase, implying that he will not make such a declaration today. The audience surely would have relished the commander-in-chief giving a report on the victories of Grant and Sherman, but he tells them a report on the progress of arms. He will not do that today. Lincoln begins by telling the audience everything the speech is not, and then he concludes by suggesting that he will make no prediction. The problem, as Lincoln realized, was that predictions had been made all the way through the war, and again they proved to be wrong. Predictions led to false optimism. There seemed to be nothing in this beginning paragraph that would arouse the passions of the audience. In these initial words, Lincoln does not seem to be building bridges to the Union audience. The audience is surely awaiting for something more. Is he undercutting the grand opportunity that he has at the beginning of his second inauguration? After 32 years during which no president has been reelected for a second term, and Lincoln can only muster at this second appearing. The text of the second inaugural consists of 703 words. 505 are of one syllable. It is the second shortest inaugural address on record. George Washington said, in effect, "Thank you very much," at a time when there was not much tradition. Lincoln's pattern was to read his addresses slowly. He usually spoke not more than 100 or 105 words a minute. At this rate, even incorporating applause, of which there was only 4 times when there was applause, he probably spoke for only 6 to 7 minutes. I imagine that people were still arriving as he was concluding. I want now to speak about his strategy for his speech and call your attention to 4 points in the first 2 paragraphs. The first point of this speech is to somehow emphasize the common convictions and the common concerns of everyone in the Union. And so he starts out by emphasizing common actions. Look in the second paragraph, where he uses the word all. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. Further on down, he gives the word both parties deprecated war. Lincoln is beginning, we may not fully understand it yet, to try to pull the nation together by making us all a part of both the problem and the solution. What is the word that just pulsates through that second paragraph, that really grabs our attention? He repeats it in every single sentence. It is the word war. 7 times he uses the word war. Twice he uses the pronoun it for war, so that 9 times he offers this word. What is he doing here? I'm suggesting that Lincoln himself is aghast at the capacity of Americans to inflict such damage on each other. This peace-loving nation has set itself upon a task of brutality that is almost ununderstandable. And Lincoln is suggesting here that this war, which begins as the direct object, grammatically and historically, of our concern and attention, becomes, as the war progresses, the subject. We are being carried along by the war. His first 2 paragraphs, it's like reading a Shakespearean play. We may not understand the first act until we get to the third act. In his chronicling the North, the South, the soldiers, the generals, the president, he is suggesting that all of those who thought they were in charge of the war discover, in fact, that they are being carried along by what one writer has called this destructive war. And then Lincoln comes to the last sentence of the paragraph. And the war came. I've pondered a long time how he said that sentence, and I'd like you to think with me. Did he say it as the ending of the paragraph, as a great crescendo with a dramatic voice, and the war came? How do you think he said that sentence? Anyone like to give a reply? Sadly. Softly. We don't have an audio. We wish that we did. I imagine that he said it sadly, softly, mournfully. He was the soldiers' president. He had internalized into himself the pain and emotion of these soldiers. Often he was up early in the morning visiting soldiers in the hospital. General McClellan thought he would secure certainly the soldiers' vote in the 1864 election. President Lincoln secured 75% of the soldiers' vote. I'm suggesting that his writing transcends what he has done in previous addresses, certainly the first inaugural, and rises to the elegance of prose or prose poetry. Let me suggest one reason that I make this direction. In the second paragraph, he uses the vehicle of alliteration. 8 times he takes the consonant D and repeats it again and again and again. On the occasion corresponding to this 4 years ago, all thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it. All sought to avert it. While the inaugural address, Lincoln was not a good speller, was he? Was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union, divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war. Now, did Lincoln set out to say in that second paragraph, I'm going to use alliteration? No. He uses alliteration in the first inaugural too. What does alliteration do for us? It helps you and I, the listener, to organize our thoughts, to sense the symmetry of his words. It helps with the meter and the pacing. It carries us along. This is part of the beauty of Lincoln's rhetoric. I wish we could pause to answer the question that's often in the minds of all of us. How did Lincoln become such a marvelous speaker? In 1858, a person who was writing the history of Congress sent a questionnaire. Yes, there were questionnaires in the 19th century, to everyone who had served in the House of Representatives or the Senate. And Lincoln received that questionnaire. One person who received it sent back 22 pages of self-important answers. Lincoln sent back less than a page, and when he came to that question, education, I let my historical imagination wander to those who must have sat next to him in his one term in Congress, who were from Yale or Harvard or other elite colleges. Lincoln wrote back one word in answer to that question: defective. Defective. I love the self-deprecation that he brings to his addresses. If you turn the page and start at the fourth line from the top, I suggest that when Lincoln offers these words, both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other, he embarks on a whole new territory in inaugural addresses. Oh, my friends in the Academy had said to me, surely every address before and every address since will name the name of God, and that certainly is correct. And so we can find the words of Washington and Adams and Jefferson, each one. But interestingly, no one except John Quincy Adams had ever quoted the Bible before. And Adams and all of those invocations, it's almost always in the last paragraph, and by the way, God's help too. What I'm suggesting is using theological thinking here in a much more profound way that is anchoring much of his thoughts. In 703 words, he mentions God 14 times, quotes Scripture 4 times, invokes prayer 4 times, and to the Protestant audience who was listening, they heard at least 3 or 4 other intimations of scriptural allusion. Notice, though, the way Lincoln deals with religion. He deals with it in a very sophisticated way with different levels of meaning. Both read the same Bible. When the decision was made to clear the ground at Gettysburg to prepare for this dedicatory event in November, the 6,000 bodies that were left on the battlefield, all of the things were removed from their clothing and cataloged so that members of the family could come to get the jewelry, the notebook, the whatever it was on the clothing. What chiefly survived were Bibles. Both read the same Bible. The American Bible Society, the flagship of over 300 voluntary associations that sprung into being in the early 19th century, the only one remaining at the beginning of the 21st century, printed over 5 million Bibles. The Confederate Bible Society printed a couple of million too. So every soldier carried a Bible with him, and they couldn't carry a Bible of this size, so quickly they printed pocket Bibles. One of the most intriguing parts of my research was to visit the American Bible Society headquarters and to handle these pocket Bibles, Union and Confederate, often with words of inscription at the beginning. So at Lincoln's first level of meaning, he is affirming this use of the Bible, but he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say, and each invokes his aid against the other. Found himself often in a difficult kind of lover's quarrel with those who were religious. I think again somewhat like my students at UCLA who would come up to me again and again and say, I am not religious, but I am spiritual. Well, I'm not sure if we'd say Lincoln was not religious, but he was theological, or he was spiritual, but we've been put off by the fact that he didn't join a church to fail to recognize the deep theological thinking that is taking place in his addresses. Another reason that we haven't recognized it is that in his other addresses, you can go back and find the antecedents in a whole train of addresses. So the House Divided speech of 1858 doesn't just arrive, you can see the antecedents in previous speeches. That is much more difficult to do in Lincoln's second inaugural. And I argue that those antecedents are often, usually not in public addresses, but are in private correspondence. Yes, some of it was published. In interviews, his wonderful interview with the 2 wives of the Confederate soldiers, which he carried on for 3 days with these 2 women in the White House, and then the wonderful memo that he wrote only for himself that was found after his death. But what is Lincoln doing here in his affirmation of the Bible, but also asking a question? The question is not in grammatical form, but I suggest it is a question. And each invokes his aid against the other. Or a couple of lines down, the prayers of both could not be answered. Clergymen had a habit of coming to call on Lincoln, and one group came to see him, and they said, I want you to know that we're so delighted that God is on our side. And with that, Lincoln threw up his hands and stepped back and said, I'm not at all sure of that, but I am certain that I want to try to discover what it would mean to be on God's side. I believe that Lincoln is speaking out against a tribal god, against a territorial god. I found myself writing before September 11, and I wondered after I read the proof I should keep it in, but it's certainly there in the epilogue. Abraham Lincoln speaks forever against any God bless America theology that fails to deal with evil and hypocrisy in its own house. There is great courage in this remark. After he affirms the use of the Bible, he questions the use of the Bible. He knows that the Bible now, in its authoritative stance, is being called into question. How can God be for and against the same thing at the same time? On sultry days at the end of August 1862, Union and Confederate forces clashed in a fierce battle at Manassas Junction, a small railroad settlement on the main road between Washington and Richmond. 13 months earlier, at the beginning of the war, the Union Army had suffered a disastrous defeat at this same Manassas. In the north, the battle was called Bull Run because of a small meandering river several miles north. Now in the summer of 1862, John Pope, his troops behind his back often called him Boastful Pope, a West Pointer who was born in Illinois and born in Kentucky and raised in Illinois, had been brought from the West and put in charge of the Army of Virginia. In the last week of August, Stonewall Jackson, ever a gambler, marched his 24,000 men 50 miles in 2 days to attack and burn the Union stacks of supplies at Manassas. Then Jackson's troops disappeared. Pope reported that he had Jackson on the run. Oh, I had all things in here in what the editors were saying, what the diarists were saying, and my editor at Simon & Schuster made me take them all out. It's part of the anticipation. This was surely going to be the great victory that would turn the tide of the war. On the morning of August 29, Pope carried out attacks against Jackson, but the next day, Robert E. Lee and Jackson fell upon Pope in what the North called the Second Battle of Bull Run. The Union troops broke and gave ground all the way back to their defenses on the outskirts of Washington. In 5 days of fighting, the Union forces of 65,000 men had suffered over 16,000 casualties. Lee and Jackson's 55,000 troops had lost fewer than 10,000 men. This defeat was a crushing blow to the North. Amid the public hand-wringing, the most public man in America convened a meeting of his cabinet. We've heard of Attorney General Bates this morning. Attorney General Bates captured Lincoln's somber mood in his diary entry for that day. He writes, "The president was deeply discouraged about the initial reports of victory had turned into news of defeat." And then he pens these words, Lincoln, quote, "seemed wrung by the bitterest anguish, said he felt almost ready to hang himself." That same day, Lincoln put pen to paper in a private musing. A brooding president strained to see the light in one of the darkest moments of the war. This is what he wrote. "I'll never forget the day I traveled to Brown University to see this document in person. The will of God prevails. In great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God. Both may be and one must be wrong. God cannot be for and against the same thing at the same time. In the present civil war, it is quite possible that God's purpose is something different from the purpose of either party, and yet the human instrumentalities, working just as they do, are of the best adaptation to effect his purpose. I'm almost ready to say this is probably true, that God wills this contest and wills that it shall not end. By his mere quiet power on the minds of the now contestants, he could have either saved or destroyed the Union without a human contest. Yet the contest began. And having begun, he could give the final victory to either side any day, yet the contest proceeds." In approaching the second inaugural address, one surely needs to contend with very, very legitimate questions. Was Lincoln speaking simply what the audience wanted to hear? Was he using biblical language because this was the language of the people of that day? What other language was there to use? I'm arguing that this meditation on the divine will, this is the title that John Hay gave to it when he discovered it after Lincoln's death, is the chief antecedent that lies behind the second inaugural. No one knew about it the day that Lincoln spoke. So that when you take your text in hand and Lincoln says the Almighty has his own purposes, I'm arguing that that's the fulcrum sentence of the entire address. That Lincoln, not in any arrogant way, is suggesting that God is the primary actor. Not that Lincoln knows how, when, where, why, but that somehow in the chronology of the first couple of paragraphs, with all the different actors, Lincoln is now suggesting that there is another actor who is at work here in this war. And Lincoln's language for that actor is what is significant. He uses words again and again. He wills, he wills. He uses the language, the living God. In approaching my topic, I came to esteemed biographers who again and again describe Lincoln as a fatalist. Fatalism is a system where what is set in place are immutable laws, and you and I respond to those laws somewhat as passive agents. Is this who Lincoln really is? Well, certainly he was a fatalist. He was a skeptic as a young man. My suggestion is that Lincoln, through the crucible of the Civil War, as Doris Kearns Goodwin started to say this morning, finds himself in a much deeper place of thought, that the Second Inaugural is almost his brooding, almost his thinking out loud, and that one of the forgotten persons in this story is Phineas Densmore Gurley, the minister of the New York Avenue Presbyterian Church here in Washington. Gurley, a graduate of Princeton Seminary, had been offered a post at the seminary because he was recognized as one of the great preachers of his day, but he stayed to be the preacher to Lincoln. And Lincoln, unlike his practice in Springfield, began to attend this church more and more frequently. Oh, he had overtures from other churches. First Presbyterian Church offered him a free pew right after the inaugural address. But those were new school churches. Those were churches that emphasized revivalism and emotionalism. Lincoln wanted a church that was rational, that was solid. As he said about Gurley, Gurley doesn't talk about politics. And I've been able to place Lincoln at least 3 sermons where we have the entire text of the sermon and we have Lincoln present, and one of those sermons is the funeral sermon for Willie. And what is Densmore Gurley preaching? He's preaching old school Presbyterian Providence, which he had heard as a student from Charles Hodge. And so the suggestion here is that Lincoln is moving in his thoughts, and we hear what we have to say is the culmination of his thinking, but it's only the beginning of his thinking in this second inaugural address. Well, the time is marching on, especially after we have started a little late, so I think I'm going to forego some of what I wanted to say, but I want to return to the question that you're going to answer. Why then? I'm going on suggesting what a marvelous speech this is, and I would want to say that Lincoln, in his earlier speeches in the 50s, was very much a partisan speaker. Often his speeches were filled with ridicule, with satire, with bombast, with barnyard imagery. But somehow when he becomes the president, his speeches begin to change, and that there's really light years between the inaugural and the second inaugural. But if so, why is the speech not popular? Would you like to offer your opinion? Yes, sir. A very good comment. The comment is Lincoln perhaps not going far enough for the radical abolitionist? Actually, if some of the abolitionists began to applaud Lincoln once the Emancipation Proclamation was offered, they began to see him in a different light. And in some ways, and I think our speaker, William Miller, this morning would agree with this, that this is a very strong statement about slavery, and he makes the statement about slavery, which we're not really able to discuss this afternoon, right in the center of his remarks. But yes, he does not discuss all of the specific questions. He has decided that those specific questions can wait for another day, which he did not have, as it turned out. Today he offers something quite different. I would say that Frederick Douglass, on the day that Lincoln was assassinated, was sitting in the community center in Rochester, New York. He had not been invited to be one of the 3 speakers by the mayor. But after those 3 white men spoke, there was a clamor that went up within the audience, Douglass, Douglass, Douglass. And Douglass was invited to speak. And as he got up the very day that Lincoln was killed, he offered his own eulogy by reciting from memory, the central portion of the third paragraph of the second inaugural address. Another question or response, why is the speech not immediately popular? Yes?
Perhaps people were expecting soaring rhetoric and he gave them common sense instead.
They were expecting soaring rhetoric and he gave them common sense instead. Was there a hand back here? Yes. The suggestion is that the speech is not triumphalist, that it's solemn, if not sad. It talks about the suffering that is involved. Yes, sir. Well said. There's a difference of opinion between the first comment, and that is that Lincoln does something quite, I would say, courageous, both politically and rhetorically, where he suggests on the eve of this great victory that there's an evil at the core of the American society, and that this evil goes back 150 years, and it's not Southern slavery, he calls it American slavery, and he dares to suggest that this is an offense before God. Just ponder that for a while as to how someone would have the courage to make such a statement at the time in which he spoke. Well, you're doing what I'm suggesting Lincoln does. He never spoke to an ideal audience. He spoke to a real audience. In the debates and other things, he was often found himself interchange. Let me just offer a couple of the responses, and then I will close. The New York Times, the publisher of the New York Times, was the chairman of the Republican Party, and this is how the New York Times responded. He makes no boasts of what he has done or promises of what he will do. He does not re-expound the principles of the war, does not redeclare the worth of the Union, does not reproclaim that absolute submission to the Constitution is the only peace. Now, those who work in the Civil War know that the newspapers of that day were even much more political than they are today, and so we probably should not be surprised when the New York World says, "It is with a blush of shame, wounded pride as American citizens, that we lay before our readers today the inaugural addresses of President Lincoln and Vice President Johnson." John Sellers, I gave you the title, which the publisher didn't use, Lincoln's Sermon on the Mount, and I did so because right away this appellation, Sermon on the Mount, became attached to this address. Frederick Douglass, who was in the crowd and who was deeply disappointed in the first inaugural, but had now come to know Lincoln, had visits with him in 1863 and 1864, he wrote in his journal for that day, "This is not a state paper, this is a sermon." And one of the most intriguing comments, which would have been on the frontispiece with a different title, came, interestingly, from the Daily Express of Petersburg. Grant was besieging Petersburg. There were not many newspapers still being published in the South, but on March 9th, the Daily Express of Petersburg, obviously puzzled, wrote this response to the second inaugural. His allusions to almighty power and his citations from scriptures might well become a preacher of righteousness. He seems to be thoroughly imbued with reverence for the gospel of peace and with faith in divine revelation. And then the writer goes on, not quite sure he wants to, I think, become too positive. We will refrain from expressing our opinion, saying with Lincoln, who borrowed the idea and most of the words from our Savior's Sermon on the Mount, "Let us judge not that we be not judged." I can't resist concluding, however, with these remarks. The English press got it immediately. Several people have been saying to me this was an English address, not an American address. I'll let you wrestle with that one. The Saturday Review offered this comment: if it had been composed by any other prominent American politician, it would have been boastful, confident, and but I like the comment from The Spectator, which, using biblical imagery, concluded, Lincoln, quote, seems destined to be one of those foolish things of the world, destined to confound the wise, one of those weak things which shall confound the things which are mighty. Thank you very much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.